Hello, and thank you for joining us for our annual video series from the International Symposium on Human Identification. Today we're speaking with Michelle Peck. Hi, Michelle.
Hi, Laura. How are you?
I'm doing good. Thank you so much for joining us. Maybe you can tell our viewers a little bit about yourself.
Hi. Yes, I'm Michelle Peck, and I work at the International Commission for Missing Persons, and I'm the Research and Validation Manager at the laboratory.
Can you tell us a little bit more about ICMP?
Yes, of course. The ICMP is an international organization, and we assist governments in identifying missing persons that may go missing due to conflicts, to natural disasters, to human rights abuses, and for various reasons. Some current contexts that we're working in are the former Yugoslavia. We have projects in Mexico and Brazil and Iraq, just to name a few. But our support is cross-cutting. We have legal assistance. We work with civil society organizations. And then, of course, we give technical support. And that's from data systems to anthropology to then, of course, DNA testing.
Well, speaking of DNA testing, ISHI focuses on forensic DNA. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the DNA lab at ICMP.
Of course. The DNA lab is an ISO 17025 accredited laboratory. So we do DNA profile testing, we do human identification through database kinship matching. And so our main source of samples are post-mortem samples that are most often from bone or teeth samples. Of course, they can be quite challenging. And then critical to kinship matching is having family reference samples. So that's also a big part of our testing. So we profile those samples, which are most often blood samples, maybe buccal, and then we put those into our databases.
Wonderful. You know, I always like to get a little bit of backstory. How did you come to work at ICMP?
Yeah, so I started at ICMP 3 years ago, and this corresponded with a move for the whole organization and actually the laboratory from Bosnia, which is where the organization was started from the context of the war in the former Yugoslavia. That's how the ICMP and the laboratory was created, or for what reason they were created. So yeah, 3 years ago, the headquarters and the lab moved to the Netherlands, so we're located in The Hague. And so, my move to the ICMP, corresponded with that. And there was also an emphasis on new technologies, particularly MPS, massively parallel sequencing. Formerly, I was at the Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory, where I gained experience in implementing MPS. So the timing worked well with the move of the lab and myself.
Wow, missing persons cases, they can be very complex. What are some of the challenges that you face?
Yeah, so there are many challenges with missing persons cases. Of course, one of the biggest challenges is the type of samples that we're dealing with, so post-mortem bone samples, as I mentioned. And so those bone samples often are of low quantity, often can be of low quality, they may be degraded, and they may also contain inhibitors, and the environmental conditions, the age of the samples can contribute to that. And while our methods are quite robust and effective, we still have situations where we are only getting partial STR profiles or failed profiles. So that, of course, is the biggest challenges. But one of the other challenges is with reference samples. And as I mentioned, for the kinship matching, that's a key component, is to have the family references, because we're not doing direct matching. So yeah, there's two challenges with reference samples. One is actually finding the family members who have loved ones missing. And so for that reason, our organization works with governments and civil society institutions to work with those families. But kind of as it relates to our testing, the other component or difficult part with reference samples is having close relatives. So the kinship matching process is complex, but it works the best with close relatives. But when you have more distant relatives, such as a niece, a nephew, or a cousin, really with STRs, the kinship matching is nearly impossible. And then when you have both of those situations, distant relatives and a difficult sample, that just makes the challenge even greater.
I can only imagine. Maybe we can talk a little bit more about why DNA is most useful for some of the work that you're doing and how some of the new technologies have impacted that.
Right. So yeah, DNA is the most unique identifier of an individual, and often in cases the remains that we get, it may be the only option because there isn't other information. And with DNA, of course, we know genetic inheritance patterns, we know population, we have population statistics, and then also with all that information, we can make identification based on a statistical basis, which is the most reliable to be able to make an identification. So DNA is the most reliable identifier, so of course that's why we focus on that, and the success that the organization had in the former Yugoslavia was using a DNA-led approach. But so as I mentioned, there still are very challenging missing persons cases for which STR testing is insufficient, and of course that's the situations where we have challenging bone samples and distant relatives. And so for those cases, we're working on developing a massively parallel sequencing SNP panel that contains over 1,400 SNPs. And so this panel was specifically designed to meet these biggest challenges. We selected SNPs, of course, because they're the smallest possible target, which is great for degraded DNA. And then the design of the panel selected SNPs that are triallelic to maximize heterozygosity, thinking about using distant relatives. And then the assay that we're using for this is QIAGEN's QIAseq chemistry, and it incorporates a powerful feature called a unique molecular index, or a UMI. And this is particularly useful for low quantity samples because what the UMI does is allow you to trace back from your sequencing data to the unique original starting molecule. And so that's critical for, well, all samples, but particularly for difficult samples. And as I said, it was designed for to meet those challenges. So some of the evaluation we've done of the kit or of the panel is to see how it works with distant relatives. And so when we look at matching simulations, for example, for a cousin, we're able to get likelihood ratios sufficient for matching with this SNP panel, which wouldn't be possible with STRs.
The technology is amazing. We've come such a long way in a short time, it feels like. How are you applying the this MPS panel in particular?
So our first application of the panel is actually with presumptive cases. So we're using STR matching to identify potential matches where the statistics aren't high enough to issue a match report with STRs, but it allows us to identify potential matches. And so then we're testing the relevant bone samples and family reference samples with the MPS panel to work to get a match with that. But that is low throughput. So we would really like to get it into more database kinship testing where we have the bone samples with the SNPs in the database, and then the family reference samples in the database to allow for the matching that occurs and searching for matches with the SNP panel.
Okay, are there future applications that you see with this?
Yeah, so if we can move to, as I was just describing, with having these in the databases and able to do it in a higher throughput method, both with the matching, but also thinking about the laboratory process, which is a long one, but if we can roboticize that and increase the throughput with that, we're really going to be opening the door to utilizing this method on a high scale approach. And some contexts that we see it particularly being useful. One is the missing migrants crisis, where access to close relatives is often a major limitation. And then another potential application is assistance to Vietnam, where there's hundreds of thousands of missing, and there's a real emphasis on working to identify the war dead. And in that context, there's, again, the lack of close relatives, and those examples are extremely challenging due to the environment there. And again, the design of the MPS panel was meant to address these two issues. So being able to scale it up would really allow us to apply it in the context that it was designed for.
Fantastic. Are there any success stories that you're able to share with us about the MPS panel that you're working with?
Yes, so I'm very excited to share some of the initial success that we've had with the panel. So we've issued 17 match reports in relations to the continued efforts to identify the missing from the former Yugoslavia, and those are individuals that were not able to be identified with STRs. And one of our first cases was maybe one of the most interesting so far, and it involved 3 missing siblings, for which there were only 2 first cousins as the family references for those missing persons. And so, yeah, the matching expert at our lab actually did a lot of background research and investigation into the missing persons event that these bones were found at, and looking at the family pedigrees of those that were missing from that event. So there was strong evidence pointing that it was these 3 individuals, but only when we were able to do the MPS testing were we able to issue match reports for these 3 individuals. So that was really an exciting initial success, and we're eager to see how we can apply it to other cases.
That's wonderful. This work is so important. Is there any way the public can help support your work?
Yes, of course. The best way is on social media, and we have Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook accounts. And so our handle for that is at the ICMP. And so, yeah, hopefully everyone can follow us and see the work that we're doing. And yeah, we would love for people to reach out through those accounts.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time to share more about your work.
Yes, thank you, Laura. It was a pleasure.